The air in the old house was thick with the scent of camphor and decay. Ilara sat by the bedside, her grandmother's thin, papery hand clasped in her own. The old woman's breathing was a shallow rattle, each exhale a struggle against the weight of a century. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines that crowded the Crow estate, a sound that had been the backdrop to generations of her family's lives and deaths. Ilara, her grandmother rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone, her eyes clouded with age and pain, fixed on her granddaughter with an intensity that belied her frailty. You must listen. The bed. The dog. Ilara leaned closer, her expression patient but inwardly dismissive. She had heard these fragments before, warnings about the family's strange tradition, the insistence that a crow must always sleep beside one of the line's dogs. Superstition, she thought. The ramblings of a dying woman clinging to old fears. "Grandmother, it's all right," she said softly, brushing a strand of white hair from the old woman's damp forehead. "Shadow is right here. He hasn't left your side." As if on cue, the large black dog lying at the foot of the bed lifted his head. His eyes, dark and knowing, watched Ilara with an unnerving stillness. He had been her grandmother's constant companion, as his ancestors had been for every crow before them. Loyal to a fault, protective beyond reason. Ilara had always found his presence comforting, but now, under her grandmother's feverish gaze, it felt weighted. Not for comfort, the old woman insisted, her grip tightening with a surprising strength. For protection. A pact, sealed in sleep. 10 generations. The blood is thin, but the dark is thick. Her words dissolved into a fit of coughing, and she fell back against the pillows, exhausted. Ilara sighed, adjusting the blankets. "I understand," she said, though she didn't. Not really. It was an old family eccentricity, one she had never questioned. They were dog people. It was as simple as that. She had slept beside Shadow herself on many stormy nights as a child, feeling safe, guarded. There was no darkness in that. But her grandmother's eyes held a plea, a desperation that went beyond delirium. "Don't let him in your bed, child. Not after I'm gone. Break the chain. Promise me, I promise," Ilara said, the lie smooth and easy on her tongue. It was a kindness, she told herself, a way to ease a dying woman's mind. She would humor the superstition. There were no pacts, no curses, only stories told to frighten children into behaving. Her grandmother's eyes fluttered shut, the fight gone out of her. "The blood remembers," she whispered, her voice fading into the rhythm of her labored breath. "Even if you forget." Ilara stayed until the old woman slept, her own mind already turning to the practicalities that came with death, the calls to be made, the arrangements, the lonely silence that would soon fill the house. She glanced at Shadow. He had laid his head back down, but his eyes were still open, fixed on her, watching, always watching. She patted his head absently. "Just stories, boy," she murmured. But as she left the room, she felt the weight of his gaze follow her out into the hall, a silent, persistent shadow she could not shake. The silence in the manor was a physical presence, thick and heavy with the dust of decades. Ilara moved through the halls like an intruder, her footsteps echoing on warped floorboards that groaned in protest. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of mildew and aged wood, a smell that seemed to seep from the very walls. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked windows, casting weak, distorted shapes across peeling wallpaper and furniture shrouded in white sheets. Every surface was layered in dust, undisturbed for years except by the slow, patient work of spiders. Cobwebs hung like delicate veils in corners, swaying gently in the draft that whispered through unseen cracks. Ilara's grandmother had kept only a few rooms habitable near the end. The rest of the manor had been left to decay, a monument to a family that had dwindled to almost nothing. Now, with the funeral over and the will read, the entirety of the Crow estate was hers. The responsibility felt less like an inheritance and more like a sentence. She paused in the main gallery, a long, high-ceilinged room that ran the length of the manor's east wing. Portraits lined the walls, generations of crows staring out from gilded frames with stern, unsmiling faces. And beside each of them, without exception, sat a dog. They were all large, dark-furred animals, each bearing a striking resemblance to Shadow. Their poses were formal, regal, but it was their eyes that held Ilara's attention. They were painted with an unsettling intensity, too knowing, too focused. They didn't look like pets. They looked like partners, sentinels. She moved closer to a portrait of a severe-looking man from the late 1800s, identified on a small plaque as Alistair Crow. His hand rested on the head of a massive hound. The dog's eyes, a piercing shade of amber, seemed to follow her as she shifted her weight. She blinked, dismissing it as a trick of the light and the warped varnish. But a chill crept up her spine nonetheless. She noticed subtle details she'd never seen before. In one portrait, a woman's smile seemed a little too wide, her canine teeth just a fraction too prominent. In another, a man's fingers, resting on his thigh, appeared unusually thick and blunt, more like paws than hands. Were these the artist's quirks, or something else? Her grandmother's warnings echoed faintly in her memory, but she pushed them away. It was just the strange, gloomy atmosphere playing on her nerves. A soft sound made her freeze. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching, like claws on old wood. It seemed to come from inside the wall to her right. She held her breath, listening. The sound stopped. The only noise was the creak of the house settling and the distant moan of the wind. She was alone. She knew she was alone. Yet the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It was a prickle on the back of her neck, a certainty that from the shadows of the hall or the dark eyes of the portraits, something was observing her exploration of its domain. Shaking her head, she turned from the gallery, deciding to retreat to the familiar, lived-in part of the house. The scratching did not start again, but the silence that replaced it felt even more menacing, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The pull of the attic was undeniable, a magnetic draw that overrode Ilara's unease. A narrow, hidden door behind a moth-eaten tapestry in the upstairs hall led to a steep, creaking staircase that ascended into near-total darkness. The air that drifted down was stale and cold, carrying the faint, sweet smell of old paper and forgotten things. She climbed slowly, each step protesting under her weight. The beam of her flashlight cut a shaky path through the oppressive black, illuminating swirling motes of dust and the thick, ragged webs that draped from the low, slanted ceiling. The attic was a cavern of accumulated history, filled with the spectral shapes of sheet-covered furniture, stacks of leather-bound trunks, and towers of cardboard boxes swollen with damp. Her light swept across the far wall, catching the dull glint of metal. A small, iron-banded chest was tucked beneath the eaves, half hidden behind a broken rocking horse. It was out of place, too sturdy and intentional amongst the chaotic jumble of relics. There was no lock, but the lid was heavy, sealed shut by years of grime and disuse. She had to use a rusted fire poker from a nearby heap to pry it open, the screech of protesting metal unnaturally loud in the silent space. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single object, a journal. Its cover was of cracked, dark leather, worn smooth at the edges from handling. A small, tarnished silver lock held it closed, but the hasp was loose. The mechanism corroded with age. It yielded with little pressure. The pages within were brittle and yellowed, the handwriting a precise, sloping script in faded brown ink. The name on the inside cover was unmistakable. Elias Crow, 1782. The founder, her many times great-grandfather. Ilara sank onto a dusty trunk, the flashlight propped beside her. She turned the pages with careful fingers, the paper whispering like dry leaves. The entries were not a chronicle of daily life, but something far more deliberate. They spoke of hardship, of carving a life from the unforgiving wilderness, of fear. October 17th, 1782. The first relevant entry began. The winter promises to be cruel. Game is scarce, and the threats from man and nature are ever present. We are too few, too vulnerable. Our courage wanes with the light. She turned the page. The writing here was darker, the letters pressed into the paper with a fervent intensity. I have made a compact, a bargain for our survival. The old ways speak of alliances with creatures of keen instinct and fierce loyalty. I have chosen a hound from the litter of the sturdiest bitch in the territory, a creature of shadow and silence. The terms are simple: strength for my bloodline, loyalty unto death. The seal is proximity, the bond is forged in shared rest, a mingling of breath and spirit in the vulnerable hours of sleep. We shall never want for protection again. Ilara's skin prickled. This was the source of her grandmother's ramblings. Not superstition, but a recorded pact, a transaction. She read on, but Elias was frustratingly vague. He wrote of heightened senses, of a newfound sharpness that kept his family safe from predators and rivals. He wrote of the hound's preternatural loyalty, its ability to sense malice from miles away. But he also alluded to a cost, a price paid in the quiet of the night. The warmth of the beast is a comfort, he wrote, but its dreams are not its own. They become yours, and yours, theirs. The journal offered no clearer explanation. It was a record of benefits accepted, not horrors detailed. Yet, a profound disquiet settled in Ilara's stomach. This was no simple tradition. It was a covenant, begun in desperation and maintained in secret. She closed the book, the lock clicking shut with a sound of grim finality. The watchful silence of the attic felt different now. It felt earned, and it felt like it was waiting for her. Sleep did not come easily. The words from Elias Crow's journal coiled in Ilara's mind like smoke, tainting the familiar shadows of her bedroom with new, unsettling implications. The weight of the old manor pressed in around her, every creak of a floorboard or sigh of the wind sounding like a whispered secret. Shadow lay at the foot of her bed, a dark, solid shape in the moonlight, his rhythmic breathing a sound she had always found comforting. Tonight, it felt like a vigil. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, her dreams were not her own. She was running, not on 2 legs, but on 4, a low, powerful gait that ate up the ground. The world was a symphony of sensation, overwhelming and exquisite. The loamy scent of damp earth filled her nostrils, rich and alive. She could smell the musk of a deer that had passed hours ago, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, the sharp, cold clarity of the night air. Her hearing was a knife's edge. The rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth was a thunderous event. The distant hoot of an owl a clear call across the valleys. There was no thought, only instinct. A raw, thrilling imperative to move, to hunt, to belong to the dark tapestry of the woods. The wind streamed through not hair, but a thick, coarse pelt. The power in her limbs was intoxicating. She woke with a violent start, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a disorienting moment, the scents of pine and prey were still thick in her nose. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating her room. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She threw back the covers, and her blood ran cold. Her feet were caked in drying mud and flecked with bits of crushed leaf and pine needle. A choked sound escaped her lips. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, staring at the evidence on her clean sheets. She hadn't been outside. She had come straight to bed after reading the journal. She looked at the floor. There were no muddy footprints leading to the bed. It was as if the earth had materialized on her skin while she slept. Her gaze snapped to the foot of the bed. Shadow was awake. He hadn't moved, but his head was raised, his ears pricked forward. His dark eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. There was no alarm in his posture, no curiosity. Only a deep, unnerving watchfulness. He looked at her, then at her muddy feet, then back to her face. It was not the look of a confused pet. It was the look of a witness, a knowing participant. A tremor of genuine, ice-cold fear went through her. This was no trick of the light, no paranoid fancy. The dream had been too vivid, the physical proof too undeniable. Elias's words echoed in her mind. Its dreams are not its own. They become yours. She looked from the mud on her feet to the dog on her bed. The pact was no longer a historical curiosity. It was in her room. It was in her head. It was on her skin. And the creature who was its living embodiment was watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. The journal felt heavier in Ilara's hands now, its cracked leather binding seeming to pulse with a malevolent warmth. She had retreated to the small, cluttered library, one of the few habitable rooms, and lit a single lamp, its weak glow pushing back only a few feet of the manor's encroaching gloom. Shadow lay by the hearth, a dark sentinel whose silent presence was no longer comforting, but accusatory. She opened the journal again, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the brittle pages. Elias Crow's precise script detailed the practicalities of the pact with a chilling matter-of-factness. The hound, a beast he named Fenrir, was not merely a pet, but a partner, and the bond demanded intimacy. Each night, without fail, a crow must share their bed with a descendant of that original hound. The lineage was meticulously recorded in the margins. Fenrir to Garmr, Garmr to Vargr, down through 10 generations to the dog now lying across the room. Shadow. The initial entries read like a ledger of blessings. Elias wrote of nights where he woke knowing, with absolute certainty, that a rival lurked beyond the tree line. He described hearing the footfall of a stalking panther as clearly as if it were beside him, smelling the taint of rot on a bandit's breath from 100 yards away. His children, he noted, could see the flick of a rabbit's ear in near-total darkness. Their hearing so acute, they whispered to avoid pain. "We are becoming sharper," he wrote, the ink dark with pride. "The wilderness fears us now. We are no longer prey." Ilara's throat tightened. She thought of her own sudden, inexplicable ability to hear the scuttling of insects in the walls, to distinguish the individual scents of rain-soaked herbs in the garden. She had dismissed it as heightened awareness born of grief and solitude. Now, it felt like a symptom. She turned the page. The tone began to shift. The benefits were now accompanied by alterations. Elias's son, Alistair, was described as developing a profound distaste for cooked meats, preferring his venison bloody and raw. His temper once even grew short and fierce. He once broke a man's arm in a dispute over a boundary line. An act of violence Elias recorded with a note of bewildered pride and unease. "The strength of the wolf is in him," he wrote. But the word wolf was scratched out and replaced with hound. Another generation down, a daughter named Cora was said to possess a low, guttural growl that would rumble in her chest when angered, a sound that made the family's hired hands uneasy. She would often be found sleepwalking in the woods, returning at dawn with burrs in her hair and the scent of the hunt on her clothes. Ilara read on, her unease curdling into a cold, hard dread in her stomach. Each generation slept with the next in the canine bloodline, and each generation exhibited stronger traits. The sharp senses remained, a coveted gift. But they were twined with a growing aggression, a territorial instinct that flared at the slightest provocation, and a dietary shift that made the family's traditional meals seem bland and unsatisfying. It was a slow, insidious unraveling, a trade. Safety and power paid for with pieces of their humanity. She looked up from the page, her eyes drawn to Shadow. He was awake, watching her, his head resting on his paws. His gaze was deep, intelligent, and utterly inscrutable. He was not just a dog. He was the latest key in a lock that was slowly turning inside of her, undoing her very nature. And she had willingly let him into her bed, fulfilling the pact her grandmother had begged her to break. The journal's entries grew shorter, the handwriting deteriorating from Elias's elegant script into a frantic, jagged scrawl. The pride and calculated acceptance that marked the earlier pages had curdled into something raw and terrified. Ilara turned each page with a growing sense of trespass, as if she were reading screams trapped in paper. One of Elias's grandsons wrote of a constant low ache in his gums, a sensitivity to light that forced him to squint even on overcast days. The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been startled away from his desk. Another, a woman named Beatrice, described her horror at finding her fingernails, once fine and delicate, had thickened into yellowed, ridged claws that snagged on her linen and broke against hard surfaces. She tried to file them down, she wrote, but they grew back harder, sharper by the next morning. I hide my hands in gloves, the entry confessed, the ink blotted as if by tears. My husband does not look at me the same. The physical changes were no longer just behavioral quirks. They were becoming undeniable, corporeal. A later descendant chronicled the emergence of his canines, which elongated past his other teeth, forcing his lip into a perpetual slight sneer. He wrote of a new, unsettling reflex. A lip would curl back unbidden to bare these sharpened teeth at a sudden noise, a gesture that was not human. The fear in the journal was no longer abstract. It was the fear of looking in the mirror and recognizing a stranger, or worse, a predator. The pact's gifts of strength and perception were now a cage, their price extracted from the flesh itself. The final entry was from Elias himself, written decades after the first. The hand was shaky, frail, the letters sprawling and desperate. The darkness we invited in has taken root in our blood. It began. It is in the marrow of our bones, the beat of our hearts. What began as strength has become a corruption. We are shedding our humanity like a skin, and what is emerging is something I cannot bear to name. My children's children speak in growls and see best in the moon's light. The hound's loyalty is absolute, but it is the loyalty of a pack to its alpha, not of a friend to a man. We are becoming them, or they, us. The line is blurred, and soon it will be erased. I see it in my own hands, the knuckles swollen, the nails like talons. I taste blood in my dreams and wake hungry for it. This is my legacy, a dynasty of monsters, born from my desperation. To any heir who finds this, see what we have become. Do not continue this madness. Break the chain, banish the hound, burn this journal. Let the line end human, even if it ends entirely. It is a kinder fate. The plea hung in the silent room, a final, agonized warning from beyond the grave. Ilara slowly closed the book. The words seemed to vibrate in the air around her. She looked at her own hands, turning them over in the lamplight. They were still her hands, slender, familiar. But for how long? The journal was not a history. It was a prophecy, and she was living it. The storm broke just after midnight, a sudden, violent assault on the old manor. Wind screamed around the eaves like a thing alive, rattling window panes and driving sheets of rain against the glass. Thunder rolled across the hills, a deep, percussive boom that shook the very foundations of the house. Each flash of lightning threw the room into stark, blinding relief. The distorted shadows of branches clawing at the walls, the portraits in the hall seeming to lean in with grasping hands. Ilara lay rigid in her bed, the journal's warnings coiled tight in her chest. Every crash of thunder was a physical blow. She pulled the blankets higher, seeking a comfort that wouldn't come. The space at the foot of the bed was empty. Shadow was gone. He had slipped away sometime after she'd blown out the lamp, a silent retreat into the storm-darkened house. Then, another sound threaded itself through the chaos of the gale. A howl. It was wrong. It rose from the woods, a long, ululating cry that was deeper than any dog's, layered with a dissonant harmony that grated on the ear. It was too intelligent, too coordinated, as if multiple throats were shaping a single, terrible note. It wasn't a sound of loneliness or communication. It was a declaration, a claim. It came again, closer this time. Ilara sat up, her blood running cold. Her new, sharpened hearing parsed the sound, isolating its unnatural qualities, the guttural undertone, the vibrating intensity that spoke of immense lung power. This was not one of the farm dogs from the valley. This was something else. A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed by the splintering crash of a tree falling somewhere on the grounds. In the brief, profound silence that followed, Ilara heard another sound, entirely. Close, right outside her door. A slow, deliberate scraping. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound came again, a dry, rasping drag, like something hard being drawn down the length of the old oak door. Lightning flashed. Illuminated in the stark white light, she saw them. 3 deep, parallel grooves scored into the wood of her bedroom door, starting at the height of her waist and trailing down toward the floor. They were fresh, the pale, splintered wood gleaming against the dark stain. Claw marks. Something had been out there. Something with claws like carving knives. Had it been trying to get in? Or had something that belonged in her room, been trying to get out? Her eyes darted back to the empty space at the foot of her bed. The storm, the howling, the marks on the door, it all spiraled back to Shadow's absence. A cold certainty settled over her. The pact was not just in her blood or her dreams. It was in the house. It was in the storm, and it was hunting. Dawn broke gray and sodden, the storm having exhausted itself into a steady, dismal rain. Ilara moved through the quiet house, her senses strained, every creak of the floorboard setting her nerves on edge. The claw marks on her door were a silent scream in the morning light, undeniable and vicious. Shadow was still missing. A cold, sick dread had settled in her stomach, but beneath it ran a current of something else, a sharp, prickling urgency that drove her to action. It wasn't just concern for a lost pet. It was the need to know, to see. She pulled on a waxed coat and boots, her movements brisk, purposeful. The journal's warnings were a drumbeat in her mind, but the instinct to find him was stronger. She pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the wet world. The woods were a different place after the storm. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pine, damp earth, and something else, a coppery, metallic tang that made the back of her throat tighten. She didn't need to search for a trail. It was laid out for her, a brutal path of carnage leading from the tree line. A rabbit, torn nearly in two, its fur matted with rain and dark blood. A little farther on, a fox, its throat ripped out, its body strangely arranged, almost ritualistic, rather than simply fed upon. The kills were not messy. They were efficient, brutal, and precise. This wasn't the work of a starving predator. It was a display, a statement. Ilara's breath fogged in the cold air as she followed the grisly trail deeper into the forest. Her heart hammered, but her feet were steady. Her new senses were fully awake, the world rendered in hyper-clarity. She could smell the individual scents of decay on each carcass, hear the drip of water from a specific branch yards away. The forest felt both vast and intimately close. The trail led to a small clearing where the butchery was even more pronounced. The remains of a young deer were scattered, bones cracked open for marrow. And there, trampled into the churned mud beside a hoof, was a familiar impression, a large paw print, deeper and broader than any dog's should be. A twig snapped to her left. She froze, every muscle tensed. Her head turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. The rain pattered softly on the leaves. Nothing moved. Then, in the deep shadows between two ancient oaks, something shifted. It was a coalescence of darkness, a shape that seemed to absorb the weak light. It was large, far larger than Shadow, and its form was wrong. The silhouette seemed to have too many jointed legs, moving with a skittering, insectile grace that was utterly alien. But it was the eyes she saw first. 2 points of sickly yellow-green light that glowed with their own faint luminescence. They fixed on her, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. For a heartbeat, they held each other's gaze, the woman and the thing in the woods. A primal terror, cold and absolute, locked her in place. This was what had been in her dreams. This was what had marked her door. Then, with a sound like rustling silk and breaking twigs, it melted back into the shadows. It didn't run. It simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and wet fur, and the echoing silence of the violated woods. Ilara stood trembling. The image of those glowing eyes burned into her vision. She wasn't just looking for her dog anymore. She was following a monster. And the most terrifying part was the dawning, horrifying realization that the trail she followed might not lead away from home, but back to it. The heavy oak door of the manor closed behind Ilara with a thud that echoed through the silent, watchful house. She leaned against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The image of those glowing eyes still seared onto her retinas. The scent of the woods, wet earth, pine, and the coppery tang of blood clung to her clothes, a visceral reminder of the thing she had seen, and of the trail that had begun not with it, but with the paw print beside the deer's remains. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic human rhythm. She needed to see something familiar, something solid and real, her own face, proof that she was still herself. She moved through the dim hall on unsteady legs, her boots leaving damp prints on the dusty floorboards. The house felt different. The portraits lining the walls no longer seemed like stern ancestors. Their eyes, and the eyes of the dark hounds beside them, felt accusatory, complicit. They knew what was in the woods. They knew what was happening to her. She pushed open the door to the small water closet off the main hall. A large, tarnished mirror hung above a cracked porcelain sink. Ilara flicked on the bare bulb overhead. It buzzed, casting a jaundiced, unforgiving light. For a moment, she just stared. It was her. The same pale skin, the same dark hair pulled back from her face, the same faint freckles across her nose from a summer long past. Relief, warm and dizzying, washed over her. It had been a trick of the light in the woods, a stress-induced hallucination. She was fine. She leaned closer, peering into her own eyes, seeking that solid ground of self. And then she saw it. The light from the bulb hit her irises at a certain angle. Her pupils, which should have been round black holes in the dim light, were not round. They were vertical slits, like a cat's, like the eyes of the thing in the forest. She blinked rapidly, and for a split second, the illusion held. But as she stared, frozen, they remained, thin, dark fissures in the green of her eyes. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. Her gaze dropped to her mouth. Her lips were parted slightly from her panicked breathing. She watched, hypnotized with horror, as her upper lip twitched, then slowly, involuntarily, began to curl back. It was a silent, primal snarl. Beneath it, her teeth were exposed, her canines. They looked longer, sharper. They pressed against her lower lip, promising a bite that was no longer merely human. The urge followed a heartbeat later, a hot, foreign impulse that rose from the base of her skull. A desire to bare her teeth fully, to let a guttural growl rumble in her chest at the frightened woman in the glass. The reflection was no longer a comfort. It was a challenger, a rival on its territory. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling the sound that threatened to escape. She stumbled back from the mirror, her back hitting the doorframe. The light bulb flickered. In the strobing, intermittent darkness, her reflection seemed to shift and change, the eyes glowing faintly, the snarl becoming more pronounced. It was the face from the portraits. It was the face of the thing in the woods. She was not just seeing the change. She was feeling it. A dark, eager instinct coiling in her gut, thrilled by the fear it smelled on its own skin. The journal's warnings were not history. They were a diagnosis, and in the cold, unflinching glass, she was finally reading the symptoms on herself. The silence of the manor was a held breath. Ilara stood in the grand hall, the memory of her own distorted reflection still burning behind her eyes. The claw marks on her door, the thing in the woods, the changes in her own body. They were not isolated horrors. They were connected, pieces of a terrible puzzle whose shape was becoming dreadfully clear. The answers, she knew with a cold, sinking certainty, were not in the sunlit rooms. They were in the dark, forgotten places, the places the family had sealed away. Her grandmother had once mentioned a root cellar, used for storage before the house had modern amenities. "Nothing down there but dust and regrets," she'd said, waving a dismissive hand. But she had always been peculiarly insistent that it remain locked, the key thrown away. Ilara found the door behind a heavy, moth-eaten rug in the pantry, a squat, iron-reinforced slab set flush with the floorboards, its handle rusted shut. It took all her strength and a rusted fireplace poker to louver it open. The groan of protesting metal was deafening in the quiet house. A smell wafted up, not just damp earth and decay, but something older, more profound, the scent of dry bone and profound stillness. A set of rough stone steps descended into absolute blackness. The air that rose from the void was frigid, sucking the warmth from her skin. She retrieved her flashlight, its beam seeming feeble and intrusive as she pointed it down the stairs. She descended slowly, each step a concession to the dread coiling in her stomach. The walls were bare earth, shored up with rotting timbers. Cobwebs, thick as lace, brushed against her face and hair. The space was small, circular, and oppressively low-ceilinged, forcing her to hunch her shoulders. It was a tomb, not a cellar. Her flashlight beam swept across the far wall, and she froze. They were arranged with a macabre formality, propped upright against the earthen wall, as if in some ghastly audience. Skeletons, perhaps a dozen of them, each still clad in the tattered remnants of period clothing, rotting wool suits, the fragile lace of dresses, leather boots crumbling to dust. But it was not the clothing that held her transfixed. It was the bones themselves. The skeletons were wrong, profanely, impossibly wrong. The jaws were elongated, the mandibles fused into horrific muzzle-like structures, crowded with rows of sharp, canine teeth that were too large for a human skull. The limbs were grotesquely stretched. The arm and leg bones thickened and bowed. The joints malformed to suggest a different posture, a different way of moving. And most chilling of all, a thick, coarse-looking growth, like petrified moss, clung to the bones of the ribs and spines, a fossilized impression of what could only have been a dense, beast-like pelt. This was no graveyard. It was a gallery, a record. Her light trembled as she moved from one skeleton to the next, each a new variation on the same monstrous theme. Some had hands twisted into near paws, the finger bones fused and tipped with cruel claw-like extensions. Others had skulls with pronounced sagittal crests, suggesting powerful jaw muscles no human would ever need. 10 generations. This was the final product of Elias Crow's bargain. This was the strength and loyalty purchased in the vulnerable hours of sleep. It was a slow, generational metamorphosis, a human bloodline patiently reshaped into something else entirely, their mutated remains preserved here in the dark as a testament to the pact's grim conclusion. Her breath hitched, a sob of pure, undiluted horror trapped in her throat. This was not just a family secret. It was a family fate. The changes she saw in the mirror, the slit pupils, the lengthening teeth, were not the beginning. They were the latest chapter in a story that always ended here, in this cold, silent cellar, leaning against a wall of earth. The darkness they had invited in hadn't just taken root. It had built a nest in their very skeletons, and she was next. Her flashlight beam, unsteady in her trembling hand, continued its slow, horrified traverse of the cellar wall. The skeletal gallery was an abomination, a silent scream from the past. But her breath caught completely, the air freezing in her lungs, when the light fell upon the figure at the end. It was not a clean, ancient skeleton like the others. This one was newer, much newer. The body was slumped against the wall, still partially clad in a faded floral house dress she recognized instantly. It was her grandmother. Desiccation and the cool, dry air of the cellar had preserved her in a ghastly state between life and bone. Skin, like old parchment, stretched tight over a frame that was already beginning its monstrous transformation. Ilara's knees threatened to buckle. She forced herself closer, each step a violation. The beam of light illuminated the details she had missed from a distance. Her grandmother's hands rested in her lap. The nails were not the neatly trimmed ones Ilara remembered. They were thick, yellowed, and had grown into hardened, curving talons that scraped against the wool of her dress. Her jaw, once soft and gentle, was set in a slight, unnatural protrusion, the beginning of a muzzle that would never fully form, and around her wrists and the open collar of her dress, where skin was visible, a strange, coarse darkness mottled the flesh. Not quite hair, not quite scale, but something new and terrible trying to push its way out. This was not a body that had been placed here after a natural death. This was a body that had been changing and had been hidden here to finish the process in secret. Tucked into the bodice of the dress, a folded piece of paper, stark white against the faded fabric, caught the light. With fingers that felt numb and foreign, Ilara reached out and pulled it free. The paper was modern, the handwriting a spidery, familiar script she knew from birthday cards and grocery lists. "My dearest Ilara," it began, and the term of endearment felt like a physical blow. "If you are reading this, you have found this place, and you know. I am so sorry. I thought I was being strong. I thought I was protecting you, the only way I knew how. The world is a cruel place for a family like ours, dwindling and alone. The pact, it gives us teeth. It makes us formidable. It kept us safe when we had no one else. My mother did it for me, and her mother for her, all the way back. To break the chain felt like a betrayal, a surrender. I could not leave you vulnerable. I believed the strength was worth the price. I believed the darkness was a small thing to pay for a legacy that could endure. I continued the tradition. I slept with Shadow's sire until the day he died, and then I brought Shadow to my bed, to keep the bond strong for you. The changes had already begun in me, as they had in my mother. The aches, the cravings, the way the light began to hurt my eyes. I hid it all. I thought I could control it. I thought I could give you the strength without the rest. I was a fool. The bargain does not work that way. It takes what it is owed. Do not hate me, child. I did it out of love. A twisted, desperate love, but love all the same. I wanted you to be strong. I never wanted you to end up down here with me. Now you have a choice I was too afraid to make. Be stronger than I was." The note ended there. No signature. Just a final, wavering blot of ink. Ilara slowly lowered the paper. The horror of the skeletal gallery. The visceral shock of her grandmother's mutated corpse. It all paled next to the devastating weight of this confession. Her grandmother, who had begged her with her dying breath to break the chain, had been its most recent keeper. Her fear had not been superstition. It was first-hand knowledge. Her plea had been a warning born of horrific, personal regret. A storm of emotions warred within Ilara, a scalding anger at the betrayal, a crushing pity for the tragic, misguided love that had damned them both, and a cold, paralyzing fear for her own future. The path was laid out before her, not by a distant ancestor, but by the woman who had raised her. The woman who had believed she was handing down a shield, but had instead passed on a curse. She looked from the note to her grandmother's distorted face, forever frozen in a silent apology. The family secret was no longer an abstract horror. It was intimate. It was personal. And it was waiting for her to make her choice. The note fluttered from Ilara's numb fingers, landing soundlessly on the dusty cellar floor. The words, "I did it out of love," echoed in the silent, suffocating air, a pathetic epitaph for a life twisted by fear and duty. But the sentiment was drowned out by a sudden, violent ache that lanced through her own body, a stark and immediate refutation of her grandmother's misguided hope. It started in her joints, a deep, grinding pain as if the bones themselves were being unknit and reassembled. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the cold earthen wall, her fingers splaying against the dirt. A wave of nausea washed over her, followed by a surge of raw, animal panic. The cellar, once a place of horrifying discovery, now felt like a trap. The mutated skeletons seemed to lean in, their empty sockets watching with grim anticipation. She stumbled toward the stairs, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Every sound was a physical assault. The scuff of her boot on stone was a gunshot. The frantic rhythm of her own heart was a thunderous drumbeat in her ears. From the world above, she could hear the individual patter of rain on leaves, the creak of a branch 3 rooms away, the skittering of a beetle in the wall, a cacophony of input that scraped against her raw nerves. But worse than the pain or the sensory overload was the hunger. It uncoiled in her gut, a voracious, hollow need that had nothing to do with human sustenance. The thought of bread, of soup, of anything cooked or processed, turned her stomach. Her mouth flooded with saliva at a sudden vivid memory, the coppery scent of the mangled deer in the woods, the rich, vital warmth of its blood. The craving was visceral, a primal demand that overrode all thought, all horror, all humanity. She half fell up the cellar steps, her body screaming in protest. She had to get away from those watching bones. She had to contain this unraveling. Her grandmother had hidden down here to change. Ilara would use it to hide from what she was becoming. With a strength born of sheer terror, she dragged the heavy iron-reinforced door shut. The boom of it closing was final, a tomb sealing. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin blade of her flashlight beam shaking on the floor. She fumbled for the old iron latch, sliding it home with a rusty shriek. Locked in. She sank to the damp floor, drawing her knees to her chest. The changes were accelerating. No longer subtle hints in a mirror, but a violent, internal revolt. She could feel the shift in her own teeth, a tight, pressing ache in her gums as her canines pressed insistently against her lips. A low, involuntary whine escaped her throat, a sound she had never made before. This was not a choice anymore. It was a biological imperative. The pact, nurtured for 10 generations, was claiming its final payment. Her grandmother's love had ensured the bloodline was strong, the bond with Shadow absolute. There was no fighting it. There was only enduring it. In the profound blackness curled on the cold earth of her family's crypt, Ilara understood the true nature of the bargain. It wasn't just about sharing a bed with a dog. It was about sharing a destiny. And her destiny was down here in the dark, waiting for the last of her humanity to be sloughed away like a skin. The transformation had begun, and it would not be denied. Time lost all meaning in the cellar's absolute blackness. Ilara existed in a limbo of pain and hunger, her body a battleground where her humanity was making its last, agonizing stand. The ache in her bones was a constant fire, her senses a torrent of unbearable input. She could smell the dry rot in the timbers, the iron tang of her own fear sweat, the ancient dusty scent of the bones surrounding her. Every sound was amplified. The skitter of a centipede in the far corner was a landslide. The frantic thrum of her own pulse was a war drum. The hunger was the worst. It was a yawning void in her core, a desperate, screaming need for something raw and vital. She found herself panting, her tongue dry, fantasizing about the warm, coppery rush of blood, the satisfying tear of fresh meat. The civilized part of her recoiled in horror, but that part was growing smaller, drowned out by a rising, instinctual tide. She didn't know how long she had been down there. Hours, maybe a day, when a new sound cut through the torment. Not from inside the cellar, but from the world above. A scratch at the door. It was not the violent, splintering scrape from the night of the storm. This was different, deliberate, insistent. A familiar sound, one that had once meant a dog asking to be let in. Shadow. The thought was a lifeline, a tether to the world she was losing. With a groan, she pushed herself up, her body protesting every movement. She stumbled to the base of the stairs and looked up. The iron latch was still firmly in place. The scratching came again, right above her head. Then it stopped. She heard a soft whine, a sound that was both questioning and patient. Gathering the last of her strength, she climbed the stairs, each step a fresh agony. She placed her palm against the cold wood of the door. From the other side, she felt an answering warmth, a solid weight leaning against it, a low thump, a tail wagging. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in her chest. He was back. Her dog was back. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he was here to pull her out of this nightmare. She shoved the heavy iron latch aside and pushed the door open. The gray, rain-washed light of the pantry was blinding. She blinked, her slit pupils struggling to adjust. And then she saw him. Shadow stood there, but it was not the Shadow she knew. He was larger, his shoulders broader and more powerfully built, his frame having gained a solid, formidable mass. His black fur seemed thicker, coarser, and held a strange bluish sheen in the dim light. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. They were the same dark eyes, but the intelligence in them was profound, ancient, and utterly knowing. He looked at her disheveled hair, her dirt-stained clothes, the undeniable animal panic in her own gaze, and there was no canine confusion. There was only recognition, an assessment. He did not jump up to greet her. He did not nuzzle her hand. He simply stood, waiting. Then, his gaze shifted from her to the doorway behind him. Ilara's eyes followed. They emerged from the shadows of the hall and the kitchen like ghosts, dogs, 5 of them. They were all large, all dark-furred, all bearing the same unnerving stillness and physical bulk as Shadow. Their mutations were subtle but unmistakable. One had a jaw that seemed slightly misaligned, too heavy for its skull. Another moved with a stiff, odd gait, its hind legs jointed wrong. Their eyes, like Shadow's, glowed with a chilling, shared cognizance. They fanned out in a loose semicircle, blocking her exit from the pantry. They did not growl. They did not bare their teeth. They simply watched her with a quiet, unnerving intensity. They were not a pack of wild animals. They were a council, a reception committee. This was the family her grandmother's note had spoken of, the strength that had endured, the dark lineage she was meant to join. Shadow took a single step forward. He looked from her to the other dogs, then back to her. His message was silent, but perfectly clear. The waiting was over. The choice was now. The pack did not advance. They did not need to. Their presence was a wall, a silent, living verdict. They watched her with those ancient, knowing eyes, not with hostility, but with an unnerving patience. They had been waiting for this, for her. Ilara stood frozen in the pantry doorway, the cellar's darkness at her back feeling like a premonition. The physical changes racking her body, the aching joints, the sharpening teeth, the visceral hunger, were no longer a mysterious affliction. They were an inheritance, a summons. Her gaze was locked on Shadow. The dog she had loved, the companion of her childhood storms, was now her gatekeeper. His dark eyes held no malice, only a profound, terrible certainty. He had led her here, to this moment. The pact, sealed 10 generations ago in a desperate bid for survival, demanded its final fulfillment. Her mind, fogged with pain and instinct, clawed for clarity. The journal. Elias's frantic final plea to break the chain warred with her grandmother's tragic confession of complicity. One begged for an end. The other had believed in the grim necessity of continuation. And the journal had mentioned a way. Not just a surrender, but a ritual. A ceremony under the full moon that would either complete the transformation or break the curse. The words surfaced from her memory. Elias's formal script burned into her mind. The bond, once forged in sleep, can only be unmade or perfected beneath the eye of the hunter's moon. It requires the herbs that grow where the shadow of the great oak never lifts, the silver bowl that reflects no lie, and the will to choose, to become the alpha of the pack, or to become its sacrifice. The stakes were horrifyingly clear. Join them fully, embrace the monstrous strength that had warped her bloodline, and lead this dark family into whatever future awaited. Or attempt to sever the bond, an act the journal implied would be met with immediate, violent retribution from the very creatures who saw her as their rightful heir. This was not a choice between life and death. It was a choice between two kinds of death. The death of her humanity or the death of her body. A low whine brought her back to the present. One of the other dogs, a massive brute with a thickened, scarred muzzle, shifted its weight impatiently. The sound was not a threat. It was a reminder. Time was pressing. The pull of the moon was a tangible force in her blood, a ticking clock counting down to its zenith. Ilara looked from the mutated pack to the familiar decaying kitchen around her, the chipped plates in the drainer, the faded calendar on the wall, the last vestiges of a normal life. Then she looked down at her own hands. The nails were thickening, the knuckles swelling. She could feel the new, sharp points of her canines pressing against her lower lip. The choice was an illusion. She was already changing. The only real choice was how she met it. With a breath that shuddered through her entire frame, she took a step forward. The pack watched, unmoving. "I need the journal," she said, her voice a raw, unfamiliar rasp. Shadow's tail gave a single, slow thump against the floorboards. He understood. The ritual would be observed. The choice had been made. Now she had to prepare to face it. The journal lay open on the kitchen table, its brittle pages a map to her damnation or her deliverance. The pack had retreated, melting back into the shadows of the house. But Ilara felt their presence like a pressure in the air. They were waiting, patient and watchful, granting her the space to gather what was required. Shadow remained, a silent sentinel by the back door, his dark eyes tracking her every move. The list was short, but each item felt weighted with grim significance. Elias's instructions were precise, each object a key in a lock she was no longer sure she wanted to open. Silverweed. The journal named first, that which grows in the permanent shadow of the great western oak. Ilara knew the tree, a gnarled, ancient sentinel on the edge of the property, its branches so thick they created a perpetual twilight beneath. She pulled on her coat, her movements stiff and aching, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and gleaming. Her new senses, once a source of terror, now felt like tools. She could smell the specific, sharp scent of the silverweed from 20 yards away, a metallic tang like cold coin mixed with damp soil. She found the patch in the deep gloom under the oak, its leaves a pale, almost luminous gray. Plucking a handful felt like theft, like taking something that did not belong to the sunlit world. Next, the silver bowl that reflects no lie. It was in the dining room sideboard, tucked behind tarnished silverware, a simple hammered basin blackened with age. As she polished it with a soft cloth, her own face swam into view in the dim light. The two sharp teeth, the flicker of slit pupils. The bowl did indeed reflect no lie. It showed the truth she was trying to outrun. Each item gathered was a farewell. The silverweed was a handful of shadows. The bowl was a mirror to a fading self. This was not preparation for a ritual. It was the dismantling of a life. She was gathering the components of her own funeral, or her rebirth. The final requirement was the easiest and the hardest: the will to choose. Back in the kitchen, she laid the items beside the journal. The pull of the moon was a physical ache now, a tidal force drawing the beast in her blood to the surface. The hunger was a sharp, twisting knife in her gut. The thought of the ritual, of surrendering completely, terrified her. But the thought of attempting to break the curse terrified her more. To be torn apart by the pack, by Shadow for the crime of rejecting them. The journal's warning was clear. The bond, once offered, cannot be refused without consequence. She looked at the cellar door, seeing in her mind's eye the gallery of mutated skeletons, her grandmother's guilt-ridden corpse. That was the future, a slow decay into monstrosity, hidden away in the dark. Or a quick, violent end at the jaws of her own family's legacy. Her hand went to her throat, where her pulse hammered a frantic human rhythm. She could almost feel the teeth. She thought of finding a sharp knife, of ending it herself on her own terms, a clean death before the moon rose. As if sensing the turn of her thoughts, Shadow whined softly. He pushed away from the door and came to her side, not demanding, but present. He leaned his heavy head against her thigh, a gesture of comfort that was also a claim. He was her oldest friend, her guardian, and her jailer. His loyalty was absolute, but it was the loyalty of the pack. To choose death was to betray that. To choose the ritual was to honor it. The conflict was a vice around her heart. She was not choosing between life and death. She was choosing what kind of creature she would be when she lived, or what kind of corpse she would leave behind. Outside, the sky began to deepen toward twilight. The time for hesitation was ending. With a final, shuddering breath that felt like it tore something vital from her chest, Ilara picked up the silver bowl and the clutch of silverweed. The choice was made. It was not made with courage, but with a desperate, survivalist love for the shadow at her side and a primal, screaming fear of the teeth in the dark. She would face the moon. She would complete the ritual. She would live. The moon rose, a perfect, bloated disk of bone-white light that washed the world in monochrome. It called to the blood in her veins, a silent, piercing summons that drowned out all other thought. Ilara stood in the clearing behind the manor, the place where the journal had dictated the ritual must be performed. The silver bowl, filled with rainwater, sat at her feet, reflecting the cold eye of the moon. The scent of crushed silverweed, sharp and metallic, filled the air around her. She was not alone. They emerged from the tree line without a sound, shadows given form and weight. The pack. Shadow at their head, larger and more formidable than she had ever seen him, his dark pelt seeming to drink the moonlight. The others fanned out behind him, forming a wide, silent circle around the clearing's edge. Their eyes, reflecting the lunar glow, were fixed on her, not with hunger, but with a profound, ancient expectancy. They were not a jury. They were witnesses to a sacrament. Ilara's hands trembled as she raised them, following the instructions burned into her memory. Her voice, when she began to chant the words Elias had written, was a raw, guttural thing that was only half hers. The words were old, their meaning lost to time, but their power was undeniable. They vibrated in the air, a low hum that resonated in her teeth and bones. As she spoke, the change, which had been a slow, agonizing pressure, became a torrent. It was not a shift, but a shattering. Her joints popped and realigned with sounds like snapping twigs, a white-hot agony that dropped her to her knees. Her spine arched, vertebrae grinding as her posture was remade for a different kind of grace. The hunger she had fought became a roaring inferno, demanding not just meat, but life, heat, vitality. Her senses, already sharp, exploded. The world dissolved into an overwhelming symphony of information. She could smell the individual musk of each member of the pack, hear the rustle of a worm in the soil 3 feet below her, see the individual pores on the leaves of the trees as if they were under a microscope. It was ecstasy and torture, a blissful unity with the world and a violent divorce from her own mind. Human memory and emotion began to fray, pulled apart by the rising tide of instinct. The love for her grandmother became a confused imprint of scent and sound. The fear of the cellar faded into a simple aversion to enclosed spaces. Language itself started to unravel, words becoming meaningless shapes compared to the pure, direct communication of scent and posture and growl. The pack began to circle, their movement a slow, deliberate dance around her writhing form. Their footfalls were silent on the damp grass. They were not threatening her. They were containing the energy, shaping it, guiding the transformation with their presence. This was their purpose. This was the pact fulfilled. Ilara threw her head back, a scream tearing from her throat. It started as a human cry of agony but distorted, deepening, lengthening into something else entirely. A long, resonant howl that was answered by the pack in a chilling, harmonious chorus. It was a sound of welcome. The final shift was not visual, but visceral. The last clinging shred of her humanity didn't fade. It was consumed. The part of her that was Ilara Crow, the woman who loved books and sunlight and quiet rooms, was swallowed whole by a newer, older, more powerful consciousness. It was a consciousness of pack, of territory, of wind and scent and blood and moon. The pain ceased. The hunger remained. But it was now a familiar tool, not a foreign invader. She pushed herself up from the ground, her movement fluid and powerful. No longer a clumsy bipedal stumble, but a graceful four-limbed rise. She looked down at the silver bowl. The moon's reflection shimmered on its surface, and in it, she saw a form that was both terrifying and magnificent. A sleek, powerful blend of woman and beast, with glowing eyes that held the cold, intelligent light of the full moon. There was no horror left in her to feel, only recognition. The ritual was complete. The air was gone. The Alpha was born. Power thrummed through her, a current of raw, untamed instinct that had burned away the last vestiges of human frailty. The world was no longer a place to be observed, but a territory to be known. Every scent a story, every sound a map, the very air a medium through which intention could be broadcast and understood. She was no longer Ilara. She was something older, something absolute. The pack watched her, their postures relaxed yet attentive, heads slightly lowered in a deference that was not submission, but acknowledgement. They had witnessed the transformation. They had sung the chorus to her solo. The hierarchy, ancient and unspoken, had been settled in the blood-deep language of the ritual. She was the apex, the culmination. Shadow stepped forward from the circle, his movement fluid and silent. He did not approach as a pet, but as a second, a lieutenant. He nudged the silver bowl with his nose, the gesture deliberate. It was a relic of a finished ceremony, of a closed chapter. A low rumble built in her chest, not a growl of threat, but a sound of command, deep, resonant, and carrying an authority that needed no words. At the sound, the pack shifted, turning as one toward the dark line of the woods. The time for waiting was over. The territory called. She took a step, then another, her gait a powerful, effortless lope that carried her across the clearing. The pack fell in behind her, a silent, flowing shadow at her back. But at the edge of the trees, she paused. A final, flickering impulse, a ghost in the machine of her new consciousness, made her turn her head. The Crow Manor stood silhouetted against the moon-washed sky, its windows dark, its angles sharp and broken. It was a tomb, a museum of a failed species. It held the dust of her human fears, the brittle pages of a history that had led inexorably to this moment. There was no regret in the look, no sentimental longing, only a final, cold assessment. It was a cage she had escaped. She turned away, her gaze fixing on the deep, welcoming darkness of the forest. The past was a scent on the wind, already fading. The future was a trail to be run. With a final, soft chuff of breath that hung in the cold air, she led her pack into the trees. They moved as one entity, a single purpose woven from many parts, leaving the crumbling world of man behind. The cycle had not been broken, it had been perfected. And a new, dark lineage had its alpha,